My son banished me from his life 15 years ago. Yesterday he called me again, but only to ask for my house. I sat in my quiet kitchen when the phone rang, the sound cutting through the stale air. My dinner sat untouched on the plate, meatloaf cooling beside potatoes gone stiff with congealed gravy. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking another evening alone in the house where my wife and I once built our family, since she passed. These walls have known only silence, broken by the occasional creak of wood settling or the hum of the refrigerator. Then came the voice I had not heard in over a decade. "Hi, Dad, it is me. I need your house." The words were smooth, carefully chosen, almost professional. He wanted me to sign documents to transfer the title, to let him use my home as collateral for what he called the deal of a lifetime. He spoke of a business investment. Money that would change everything, but his tone shifted when he mentioned the party, his engagement celebration. He wanted to host it right here under my roof so he could present himself to his future in-laws as a man with roots, with stability, with a proud father standing quietly in the background. In his story, my home was not my sanctuary but his stage. I held the receiver, listening, but my mind traveled back to the day of his wedding when I was told not to pose in family photos, to the envelopes I mailed that came back unopened, to the silence that had grown thick and permanent between us. For 15 years I was a ghost to my own child, and now suddenly he remembered me, not as a father, not as family, but as the owner of a house he needed. The bitterness rose like bile, but behind it a new thought began to form. He believed he was calling me for a gift. What he did not know was that I already had a plan. 15 years is a long time, but pain has a way of keeping itself fresh. It does not fade like old paint on the walls or wear away like the soles of shoes. It lingers, sharp as glass. When I heard my son's voice on the phone yesterday, asking for my house as if it were nothing more than a tool for his plans, the wound I had lived with tore itself open again. To understand the bitterness that filled me in that moment, you need to know the night it all began. It was the evening after his wedding. The celebration had been loud and bright, filled with laughter that echoed through the banquet hall. I remember standing outside in the parking lot, watching guests pour out into the night air, carrying the weight of champagne and promises. They took photos with him, arm in arm, new in-laws, friends from the city, everyone smiling under the string lights. I was there, but not really there. My invitation had been an afterthought, a formality. And when the family gathered for official portraits, someone had quietly told me to step aside. The bride's family wanted a clean frame, they said, just the young couple and their real family. I had stood in the corner, clutching the sleeve of my old suit, trying to ignore the sting. I told myself it was nerves, that things would feel different once the wedding rush passed. But the next evening, when the lights in my modest kitchen flickered over a plate of reheated leftovers, my phone buzzed with a message. The words were short, stripped of affection, delivered with the blunt force of a knife. "From now on, do not contact me. I have my own family now." I sat at the table, staring at the screen. My fork slipped from my fingers and clattered against the plate. The message was not long, but it carried the weight of 1,000 rejections. My son was telling me in the plainest terms possible that I no longer existed in his life. I wanted to argue, to plead, but the silence after that message was heavier than anything I had ever known. That night I went upstairs and opened a drawer I had not touched in months. Inside was a wedding frame I had bought from a department store, one side for the bride, one for the groom, and the middle reserved for family. The left side remained empty, the right side half filled with a single photograph I had managed to take. My boy in his suit, smiling at the world, standing beside a woman who looked at him as if he were her salvation. The space beside them gaped like an open wound, a blank panel where a father's place should have been. I held that frame in my hands until dawn, the emptiness reflecting my own. It was not just that night. Over the years, the wound deepened. Letters I wrote came back unopened, the envelopes stamped with mechanical indifference, returned to sender. I kept them in a shoebox for a time, hoping someday he might want to read them, until the weight of hope became too heavy. Holiday cards with cheerful snowmen or autumn leaves, all unopened, all rejected. Phone calls were worse. At first the line would ring, then switch to voicemail. Later the number was disconnected. Finally, when I tried from a friend's phone, I heard the truth. He had blocked me. The humiliation of being erased is not loud, it is quiet. It is the sound of no answer, of silence when you say hello into a void. It is standing outside of milestones, birthdays, promotions, holidays, and realizing you are the only one who remembers. It is being told without words that your presence is more damaging than your absence. I spent years convincing myself there was some reason. Maybe his wife disapproved of me. Maybe he was ashamed of our old house with its peeling paint and patched roof. Maybe he thought my grief after his mother's death had made me weak. But as the years stretched on, I had to accept the harsher truth. He had chosen to cut me out, to live a life where I did not exist, where his story began at the altar and my role ended the night before. That memory haunted me when the phone rang again, when his voice carried the false warmth of someone who had practiced his lines. It reminded me of the blank frame, the unopened letters, the way his message had read like a verdict. 15 years of silence, broken only when he needed something from me. This was the cut. This was the scar he carved into me, and it was this scar that shaped my answer. Because when a man learns he can be erased by his own blood, he also learns that forgiveness without change is just another form of humiliation. My son thought he was calling me for help, but he was about to learn that I remembered everything, every silence, every unopened letter, every rejection. The call came the evening after the news of my lottery win had long faded into whispers in my small neighborhood. The rain had eased outside, leaving the streets shining under the street lamps. I sat in my chair with a cup of coffee cooling in my hand when the phone rang again. The same voice I had not heard in 15 years now returned, carrying a strange mix of urgency and forced warmth. "Hi, Dad," he said, dragging the word just long enough to suggest he was testing how it sounded in his mouth after years of disuse. He spoke quickly, without the pauses of someone reconnecting for love or memory. "I need your help." I waited, my silence heavy in the line. Then he said it clearly, as if reciting from a script. "I need you to sign a quitclaim deed on the house, just one signature. That way I can use it as collateral." "This is big, Dad, the deal of a lifetime." I gripped the phone, staring at the peeling wallpaper in front of me. My own son had reduced me to a line on a legal form, not a father, not family, but an owner whose property could serve as leverage. I asked him, why now? Why after 15 years? Answer came smoothly, rehearsed. "Because family should be there for each other, Dad. Because you know I am building a future." But there was more. He wanted to host his engagement party at my home, the same home where his mother's laughter once filled the rooms, where birthdays and Christmases had been celebrated before he decided I no longer belonged. He wanted the setting, the photographs, the proof of stability for his fiancée's wealthy family. "It will look good, Dad," he explained. "They need to see where I come from, that I have roots. This house will show them everything." Roots, the word tasted bitter. Roots he had severed himself when he sent me that message on his wedding night, cutting me out like a diseased branch. Now he wanted to graft those roots back only because they suited his ambitions. The conversation shifted as he grew impatient with my silence. "Look, Dad, this is not complicated. You just have to sign one piece of paper, one signature. That is all. Do this and I can close the deal. Do this and you will finally see me succeed." I thought of his words like weights on a scale. Do this, one signature, one paper. A father measured not by years of sacrifice, but by the ink of his name on a line. It was not a request, it was a transaction. The kind that stripped away the last layer of affection and revealed what he truly saw me as, a means to an end. I asked him about his fiancée, about why the party had to be here. His voice lit up with enthusiasm, but it was shallow, hollow. He spoke of appearances, of impressing her parents, of sealing investments tied to the family name. "This party," he said, "is everything. You show up, you smile, and you sign the paper. That is your part, that is your part," as if I were cast in a role not as his father but as a prop in his show. The old house I kept standing through years of double shifts and lonely nights was not a home to him. It was a stage. My presence was not love. It was a backdrop for the image he wanted to sell. The weight of his words hung in the air after the call ended. My hand shook as I placed the phone back in its cradle. For 15 years he had wanted nothing. Not a birthday greeting, not a holiday visit, not even the courtesy of a returned letter. But now, suddenly, I was essential, not because of who I was, but because of what I owned. I sat in the silence of my kitchen, the old clock ticking in steady defiance. My son believed he had reached out for a gift. He believed all he needed was a paper and a house. What he did not understand was that in the space between his demand and my silence, something had shifted. I was no longer the man begging to be part of his life. I was a man holding the key to the one thing he thought he could claim without consequence. He had turned blood into business, and he had no idea how costly that choice would be. I knew better than to take his sudden warmth at face value. A man who had erased me for 15 years did not simply rediscover his father overnight. He had called because he needed something, and need often wears the mask of affection. If I wanted to know the truth, I would have to set a snare, a quiet test that would force him to reveal what lay beneath the charm. The next evening I called him back. My hand trembled only once before I steadied it, and when he answered, his voice was already painted with confidence. "Dad, I knew you would come around. We can get the papers signed next week." His eagerness bled through the line, but I kept my own tone measured, casual. I told him there might be a problem. I lowered my voice as though ashamed of it. "The house," I said slowly, "is tangled in old tax debt, back payments. They are sending someone to inspect the property. Until that is settled, no bank will touch it." For a moment there was silence. Not the silence of sympathy, not the pause of a son processing his father's hardship. This was the silence of calculation, 3 seconds, 4 at most. Then came his answer, quick and cold, stripped of the practiced sugar. "Then it is useless to me." The words struck like ice water. My own son had just dismissed not only the house, but me with it. In his eyes, if the property could not be used, neither could the man who owned it. His tone shifted almost instantly, softening, reaching for the mask he had dropped. "I mean, of course, Dad, that it is terrible for you. That must be stressful. We will figure something out together." His voice stretched those last words, bending them to sound like comfort, but the damage was done. I kept my own tone even, as if I had not noticed the blade he had just slipped between my ribs. Inside, though, I was already writing down every word. I pulled a notepad closer on the kitchen table and scribbled the phrase exactly as he had spoken it. "Then it is useless to me." That note sat on the page like a confession. Proof that he did not care about reconciliation, proof that he had not called to heal old wounds. He had called because he believed I was a bank with a familiar face, a signature to be harvested. I wrote the words twice, underlining them until the pen nearly tore the paper. We spoke a little longer. He tried to recover, asking after my health, pretending to care about the quiet life I led, but the false interest rang hollow. Like a salesman making small talk before circling back to his pitch. I kept him talking, nodding into the receiver, watching the way he maneuvered back to the subject of the house again and again. By the time we said goodbye, the mask was back in place. He ended the call with warmth that might have fooled anyone else. "Love you, Dad," he said lightly, the words landing with no weight at all. I wrote those down too, just beneath his earlier line, side by side. They told the real story. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the notepad in front of me. The phrase glared up at me like a verdict, useless to me. That was who I was to him without the house. Not a father, not family, just useless. The test had worked. The mask had slipped, and now I knew exactly what kind of son I was dealing with. The test had shown me what I needed to know about his motives. He did not want reconciliation. He wanted a transaction. But I also knew that kind of hunger never comes from nowhere. If he was desperate enough to circle back to a father he had abandoned 15 years earlier, then something in his own world was falling apart. I decided to dig. My old computer groaned to life in the spare bedroom. The fan rattled, the screen flickered, but soon enough the search box appeared. I typed his name slowly, my fingers stiff from years of disuse on the keyboard. His name, followed by the letters LLC. It felt like I was opening a door I had no wish to enter, but one that had to be opened all the same. The first pages looked polished, professional headshots, articles about entrepreneurial spirit. Mentions of sustainability and innovation. To the casual reader, it painted a picture of success. My son had learned how to market himself well, just as he had learned to smile for the cameras at his wedding. But I read more carefully. I dug deeper than the first layer of search results. By the third page, the gloss began to crack. I found an article about a construction project in the city that never broke ground. $500,000 collected from investors, promises of affordable housing, but nothing built. The contractor filed a complaint, unpaid invoices stacking up until he was forced to abandon the site. The name of the managing LLC was my son's. I clicked further and found another case. A widow had filed a grievance online, her words shaky but determined. She had given a large deposit for a rental property he advertised. The house never existed. The deposit vanished. She wrote about losing her savings, the last money she had after her husband's death. The police report had been filed, but the process stalled, buried in paperwork. By midnight, I had traced another venture, a so-called partnership in a consulting firm. A small business owner had believed his promises, signed over funds for a marketing campaign, and never saw him again. The business folded within the year. The man's testimony was bitter, almost broken. He called my son a predator in a suit. I sat back from the keyboard, the glow of the screen casting the room in cold light. My son had not just abandoned me, he had abandoned everyone who trusted him. He had turned betrayal into a career. Each case carried the same pattern: grand promises, fast money, quick exits. He moved from one scheme to the next, leaving wreckage behind. I started a notebook, filling the first pages with names, dates, amounts. 3 stood out like bold strokes of ink: the contractor who lost months of labor and wages, the widow who lost her savings, the partner who lost his business. They were not numbers on a balance sheet. They were people left hollow by the same voice that had once called me dad. When I finally shut down the computer, the house was silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator. I stared at the notebook in front of me. For 15 years I had thought my pain was private, a wound between father and son. Now I saw it differently. My son's betrayal was not just a family matter. It was a habit, a pattern, a way of life that fed on trust and left only ashes. The stakes had changed. This was no longer only about a son who had erased his father. This was about a man who had learned to erase anyone who stood in his way, and that meant justice would require more than a father's disappointment. It would require witnesses. The notebook lay open on my kitchen table for days, its pages crowded with names, debts, and broken promises. I stared at those lines until they blurred, and in every story I heard an echo of my own. People who had believed in him, people who had trusted the smile, only to be discarded once they were no longer useful. My son had not only erased me, he had made a career out of erasing anyone who stood in his way. That truth hardened something inside me. If he wanted to play with family and reputation as if they were cards in his deck, then I would make sure he understood what it felt like when the game turned against him. The perfect opportunity came through his own arrogance. He called again, this time more animated, more desperate to make the plan sound exciting. He talked about his fiancée, the daughter of a wealthy businessman. Her father was cautious with money, he explained. And the upcoming engagement party would be his chance to prove himself, not just to her, but to her entire family. He needed to show stability, heritage, something that made him look trustworthy. And what better proof than a family home owned by a man he could present as a proud father standing behind him? I listened without interrupting. Each sentence he spoke was another nail driven into his own coffin. He did not want me at that party because I was his father. He wanted me there because I was a prop, an image, a backdrop for his story. He wanted to walk his in-laws through the house where his mother's laughter once lived, to point at the walls I had kept standing and claim it all as part of his future empire. The timing was everything. He told me the party would be held at my home on a Saturday evening in 2 weeks. Guests would be arriving from the city, investors and family alike, dressed in their finest. It would be the stage where he displayed his success, where he convinced them to open their wallets and tie their reputations to his name. All I had to do was open the door and sign a piece of paper before the night was through. I set the phone down after that call and let the silence fill me. For 15 years he had kept me out of every important moment of his life. No holidays, no birthdays, not even a seat at his own wedding. And now, suddenly, my house was the cornerstone of his image, the foundation on which he wanted to build his false credibility. It was poetic, but it was also leverage. The house was not just wood and brick. It was a stage he believed he controlled. What he did not know was that I had already begun my own script. If he wanted to gather his in-laws, his fiancée, and his potential investors under one roof, then he was also gathering an audience for the truth, and the timing could not be better. I thought of the contractor who had been left unpaid, the widow who had lost her savings, the partner who had been abandoned with nothing but debt. They deserved to see him stripped of his mask. They deserved to stand in the very room where he planned to sell his false image and deliver the truth themselves. That night I sat at the table with my notebook and began to outline the plan. I wrote it like a checklist, each step careful, deliberate, researched the timing of his party, confirm the names and contact information of those he had wronged, prepare the evidence, ensure the invitations would reach them with enough time to act. My son wanted to turn my house into a showroom for his lies. I would turn it into a courtroom for his truth. The leverage was mine now. He needed me more than I needed him. He needed the house, the image, the illusion. And because of that, he had given me the one thing I had not possessed for 15 years, power over the moment, the perfect stage, the perfect timing, and the perfect audience. I closed the notebook with steady hands, for the first time in years. I felt no weight pressing down on me. Instead, I felt the calm of a man who finally knew how the story would end. Once the outlines of my revenge had taken shape, I knew I had to move with care. Rage might burn hot, but strategy endures. If I let anger alone guide me, I would make mistakes, and mistakes were exactly what my son expected from me. To him, I was still the old man too simple to see through his schemes. He would never believe I had the patience to plan something precise, something clean, something that would not require raised voices or fists, but only the quiet weight of truth. The first step was securing the house itself. He thought of it as an asset waiting to be signed away, but I knew better. I contacted my lawyer, an old acquaintance who had helped me years ago when I settled my wife's estate. Together we created a living trust in her name. A structure that ensured the house no longer belonged to me directly, but to the trust that bore her memory. On paper, it meant I could still live here, still protect these walls, but no one else could leverage them for loans or collateral. To him, the house was a pawn, but I had just turned it into a fortress. The second step was subtle but important. I found an old notice about a pending code inspection that had been delayed years back when the city's office fell behind schedule. With a few phone calls, I arranged for a new inspection date to coincide with the very evening of his engagement party. The timing was deliberate. Nothing ruins the image of stability faster than officials stepping into a celebration with clipboards and cameras, measuring the safety of staircases and foundations while champagne glasses are raised. With the legal grounds secured, I turned to the guest list. My son thought he had chosen his audience carefully. Future in-laws, potential investors. Friends who admired his confidence. What he did not realize was that I was writing a second list, one he would never see until it was too late. I started with the contractor. Months of unpaid work had left him bitter and broken, his men scattered to other projects, his reputation scarred. When I reached out anonymously, providing documents and timelines, he did not hesitate. He wanted answers. He wanted his day to confront the man who had ruined his livelihood. Next came the widow. Her story haunted me more than the others. A deposit she could never replace, savings taken in the shadow of her husband's death. When I called, her voice trembled with both anger and relief. She had thought no one cared. Now she had a chance to face him. She promised she would come. The third was the business partner, the man who had watched his dream collapse when my son walked away with the funds. His words on the phone were sharp. Fueled by the bitterness of betrayal, "I will be there," he said. "I will not miss the chance." But it was not only the victims who would be in attendance. I contacted a title officer, a man whose work was to confirm ownership, liens, and legal restrictions. He agreed to bring the documents that proved my house was safely locked inside the living trust. He would explain to anyone listening why no quitclaim deed could change that. I also reached out to a representative from the bank, a professional voice armed with paperwork of denial. The letter had already been drafted, a refusal to grant my son any credit due to pending lawsuits and unpaid debts. That letter would arrive in his hands not as rumor but as fact. And finally, I made sure a process server was available, a man whose simple role was to deliver official documents. Lawsuits, complaints, summons, he would carry them in his briefcase, and when the moment came, he would step forward into the room and hand my son the future he had earned. I imagined the scene in my head, the music playing, the guests mingling. My son smiling with the confidence of a man who believed the night was his triumph, and then the door opening, not to gifts or congratulations, but to the people he had wronged, the officials who carried proof, the voices of truth that could not be silenced by charm. It was not violence I wanted. I had no interest in shouting or spectacle for its own sake. What I wanted was something quieter but far heavier. I wanted the truth to step into the room and sit beside him at the table, to pull the mask from his face in front of those he most wished to impress. My son thought the house would give him power, but the house would give him something else entirely: consequence. As I laid out each step in my notebook, I realized how fitting it all was. He believed I would give him a gift that night, and he was right. I would, only it would not be the house or my signature or my approval. It would be a gift wrapped in truth, delivered by those he had tried to erase, tied together with the simple ribbon of justice. The weeks before the party stretched long, but I knew I had to remain calm, steady, and careful. If I let even a flicker of suspicion cross my face, my son would sense it and adjust his plans. I had to be convincing, not only to him but also to his fiancée and the entourage he paraded through my house in the days leading up to the event. I told myself I would become an actor, slipping into the role he expected from me. He wanted the picture of a supportive, obedient father, and that was exactly what I gave him. On the surface. The first rehearsal came when he arrived one morning with a contractor, tape measure swinging from his belt, clipboard under his arm. My son walked them from room to room, speaking with the authority of a man who already believed he owned the place. He pointed to the living room beams, explaining how the house had been in the family for decades. He lingered in the dining room, telling the man this was where generations had celebrated milestones. His words were meant for the contractor, but his eyes often slid toward his fiancée, who followed behind, nodding politely. I walked at the edge of the group, hands folded behind my back, silent. I let him spin his story, let him pretend. When his fiancée asked whether the house would soon belong to him, I heard his answer clear as glass. "This house will be mine soon. Dad is signing it over." The way he said it left no room for doubt, no hesitation. It was a promise he had already woven into his image. She smiled, reassured, and placed her hand on his arm. I caught her glance toward me, expecting me to confirm it, to nod as though it were true. I forced myself to smile back, faint but steady, and said nothing. Silence, after all, can be more convincing than words. Later that evening, after the visitors had gone, I walked into the study and found a folder sitting openly on the desk. My son had left it there, almost carelessly, as though confident I would not question it. The folder contained the quitclaim deed, already filled in with his name as recipient. Bright yellow tabs marked the spaces for signatures, each one labeled in block letters, "Sign here." I stared at the papers for a long moment. The audacity of it struck me harder than his words on the phone. He had not even asked if I wanted to give up the house. He had simply assumed it, printed the forms, and laid them out like a foregone conclusion. To him, my role was as simple as putting pen to paper, a prop playing its part on cue. I lifted the folder, felt the weight of the paper in my hands, and then carried it to the kitchen. There I slid it into the top drawer of an old sideboard, one that still smelled faintly of cedar. I closed the drawer slowly, pressed the lock into place, and pocketed the small brass key. The next time he asked about the documents, I lied with the straightest face I had worn in years. I told him I wanted to wait until the party to make it official, that the gesture would mean more if his guests saw it. His eyes brightened at the thought, and he agreed immediately, his imagination already filled with visions of toasts and applause. But inside I felt a different brightness. Every rehearsal strengthened my role. Every lie I let him believe gave me more time to set the stage. He thought he was training me to perform for him. But I was the one practicing the patience, the calm, the quiet smile of a father who seemed eager to please. Behind that mask, the plan sharpened. The quitclaim deed sat locked away, untouched, while the house itself prepared to host not his triumph but his undoing. My son believed the performance was his. He had no idea I had been rehearsing my own. The evening of the party arrived with a sharp chill in the air, the kind that made the windows fog and the floorboards creak. I had spent the day preparing the house as if nothing unusual was about to happen. The carpets were vacuumed, the old dining table polished until it gleamed in the low light. Candles flickered in the corners, filling the rooms with the scent of wax and smoke. To anyone walking in, it looked like a home ready to celebrate a union. To me, it was a stage dressed for revelation. By 7 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. Cars lined the narrow street outside, headlights flashing briefly before vanishing into the night. The sound of laughter filled the hallway as men in suits and women in glittering dresses stepped across the threshold, clutching glasses of champagne my son had arranged to be served. He moved among them like a host born for the role, shaking hands, offering compliments, basking in their admiration. His fiancée glowed at his side, her parents trailing behind with polite but watchful eyes. I kept to the background as planned. To them I was the dutiful father, quiet and supportive. My son introduced me sparingly, often with a wave of the hand. "This is my father, he is very proud." Then he moved on quickly, as though I were a piece of furniture that did not require much explanation. It did not bother me. In fact, it played perfectly into the part I had rehearsed. At one point I heard him near the fireplace, raising his voice just enough to carry across the room. "This house," he said proudly, "will soon be mine. Dad is signing it over tonight." His words were like a toast to himself, a promise to his in-laws and his potential investors. His fiancée's father nodded approvingly, as if stability had just been proven with a single line. I forced a smile when eyes turned toward me, offering nothing more than a mild shrug, letting them all believe it. The music swelled, the chatter rose, and the room filled with the energy of celebration. But beneath it all, I felt the minutes ticking by. My watch read 7:55, 5 minutes until the plan began. I positioned myself near the entrance, glass in hand, close enough to the door that I could see my son's face when his guests of honor arrived. At exactly 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang, a sharp, insistent chime that cut through the laughter and music like a blade. My son paused mid-sentence, a glass of champagne halfway to his lips. He frowned, then quickly masked it with a grin. "I will get it," he said lightly, striding toward the door with his fiancée at his side. The room hushed slightly, curiosity rippling through the crowd. The doorman had already let in everyone expected, so who could this be? I took a slow sip of champagne, watching the scene unfold. My son placed his hand on the knob, turned it, and opened the door wide. 3 figures stood in the hallway. The contractor, shoulders square, holding a folder of unpaid invoices. The widow, her face pale but determined, clutching a stack of receipts. The former partner, his jaw tight, eyes burning with years of anger. They stepped inside with a kind of gravity that pulled the room quiet. Behind them came the city inspector, clipboard in hand, followed by the title officer carrying a briefcase and the process server with an envelope tucked neatly under his arm. They did not need to speak to command the room. Their presence was enough. My son's confident smile faltered, confusion flashing across his features. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tight, too loud. The widow answered first, her words trembling but clear. "This is justice." Guests shifted uncomfortably, whispers rising in corners. The investors leaned forward, sensing scandal. His fiancée's father narrowed his eyes, already measuring the situation in terms of risk. The jazz music stumbled to a halt, instruments falling silent as attention turned to the confrontation. I set my glass down and stepped closer, keeping my voice calm, steady. "Son," I said softly, "these are people you forgot to invite. People who deserve to be here as much as anyone else." His eyes darted to me, wide with shock, then narrowed with fury. "You did this." His words spat like venom, but I did not flinch. I held his gaze, my expression as calm as the clock ticking in the hallway. Around us the party atmosphere dissolved. The contractor spread his invoices on the table. The widow spoke of her savings. The partner described his losses. The inspector noted the house's status. The title officer explained the trust that barred any transfer, and finally the process server placed the envelope in my son's trembling hands. The room was silent except for the rustle of papers and the faint hiss of candles. My son stood frozen, his mask gone, his guests watching the truth unfold in real time. I looked at him one last time and said, "Happy engagement, son. This is the gift you asked for." The silence that filled the room after the papers were laid out was thicker than any words could have been. My son's eyes darted wildly from one face to another, searching for someone to rescue him, someone to defend him. But the people he had assembled for admiration were already stepping back, careful to distance themselves from the storm that had broken open in his own living room. His fiancée's hand slipped from his arm first. She stared at him, confusion clouding her face. Then turned to the widow who still clutched her receipts. The woman's trembling voice cut through the silence, describing how her life had been upended by money she never got back. The fiancée's lips parted as if to argue, but the truth was plain, the evidence undeniable. She looked back at my son, and the admiration she once wore so easily had drained into something closer to disgust. Her father was even colder. He closed the leather folder he had been carrying, the snap of it echoing louder than the fading whispers in the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply shook his head once, the kind of gesture that carried more weight than 100 angry words. Then he turned to his daughter and said, quietly but firmly, "We are leaving." My son reached for him desperately, trying to catch his sleeve, his voice breaking into panic. "Wait, this is not what it looks like. These people are lying." But the contractor spread his invoices across the table like evidence in a courtroom, each sheet signed and dated. The former partner dropped his documents beside them. The process server stepped forward and handed over a sealed envelope. The weight of the law pressed itself into my son's palm, whether he wanted it or not. One of the investors who had come for champagne and promises shook his head, muttering under his breath as he walked to the door. Others followed, women gathering coats, men finishing their drinks with sharp gulps before setting their glasses down and slipping out. The jazz musicians quietly packed their instruments, their eyes low, their movements hurried. The party was unraveling in real time. Strands of false celebration giving way to bare truth. My son turned on me then, his face flushed red, his voice rising. "What did you do?" he shouted, the words trembling with fear more than anger. "What have you done to me?" I met his eyes, steady and calm, letting my voice carry across the room without raising it. "I did not do anything," I said. "I only opened the door." The truth walked in by itself. The words seemed to hang in the air, quiet but unshakable. They did not sting with cruelty. They simply named what had already been plain for everyone to see. His fiancée turned away from him, her shoulders rigid, her hand tucked firmly into her father's arm. The man guided her toward the door, his expression carved from stone. Around us, the last of the guests left. Some whispered, some shook their heads, but none stayed. Within minutes, the lively crowd had vanished, leaving behind only empty glasses, scattered napkins, and the scent of expensive perfume clinging to the air like a ghost of what the night was supposed to be. My son stood alone in the middle of the room, the process server's envelope dangling from his hand, his papers exposed on the table for no one to admire. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, fury and shame battling in his eyes. He looked at me once more, as if daring me to gloat, but I only shook my head. This was not about humiliating him for sport. It was about balance, about consequence. I had no joy in the collapse I had just witnessed, only a steady sorrow. I had watched my son build a life out of deception, and now I had simply let the walls fall where they were already cracked. He whispered then, his voice nearly breaking, "You betrayed me." I held his gaze, my tone as even as the ticking clock on the wall. "No, son, you betrayed yourself." And with that I left him standing in the ruins of his own party, surrounded by the silence of truth. When the last guest's footsteps faded down the front walk, the house seemed to exhale. The air was heavy with the scent of spilled champagne and burnt-out candles, but quieter than it had been in years. My son stood in the wreckage of his own illusion, staring down at the envelope the process server had left him. His shoulders sagged under the weight of it, his mouth working as if he wanted to speak but could not summon the words. I did not move to comfort him. That had been my mistake too many times before, offering warmth where none had been earned. Softening blows he had brought upon himself. This time I kept my distance, leaning against the doorway with my hands folded. He finally looked at me, his eyes glassy with anger and fear. "You set me up," he said. "You wanted to ruin me." I shook my head slowly. "I did not set you up. I gave people a chance to speak. You ruined yourself a long time ago." His jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides, but he did not argue. Deep down, he knew it was true. For a long moment we stood in silence. Then I told him something I had rehearsed in my mind for weeks. "I will not give you this house," I said. "It belongs to your mother's trust now. It cannot be collateral, it cannot be stolen, and it will never be used as a bargaining chip for your schemes." His lips parted as if to protest, but I held up my hand and kept going. "What I will give you is a choice. If you want any help from me, it will not be money. It will not be property, it will be responsibility. You will face the people you have hurt. You will pay back what you can. You will give your time, your labor, your hands to repairing what you have broken. I will not fight your battles, but I will help you fight your own if you are willing to change." His face twisted, torn between pride and desperation. "And if I do not?" he asked finally, his voice low like a child's. "Then you walk out that door the same way you did 15 years ago," I answered. "You walk away and you never ask me for anything again. This house will not shelter you, and I will not be your stage." He looked at me as though I had struck him, but I kept my voice calm, firm. "I am your father, yes, but fatherhood is not a blank check. Family is not a ledger you call on only when you are broke. If you want to stand here as my son, then earn the title." The room stayed quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. He glanced at the scattered papers, the ruined party, the empty chairs where his future in-laws had sat. His world had shifted in a single night. The floor ripped out from under him, and now he faced the only thing he had spent his life avoiding: consequences. I did not press him, I did not beg, I simply left the door open. This was not about destroying him, it was about drawing the line that should have been drawn years ago. For the first time, I gave him a boundary he could not bend or buy his way around. I turned toward the hallway, leaving him in the silence of his own making. Before I stepped out of the room, I said one last thing. The door is here if you want to come back, not for money, not for property, but for family. Until then, the truth will follow you just as it has tonight. I walked away, the sound of my footsteps echoing on the old wooden floor. Behind me, he did not speak. He only stood there, holding the envelope, the mask gone, the silence heavy. For the first time in years, I felt the weight shift from my shoulders to his. And I knew it would either crush him or finally teach him how to stand. In the quiet days after the party, I began the work of turning the house from a stage of deception into something real, something lasting. I went to the lawyer and signed the final documents declaring it Anne's home, named for my late wife. It would stand not as a bargaining chip, but as a refuge, a small fund to help older working families in the neighborhood repair leaking roofs, broken furnaces, and drafty windows. Problems that can sink a family when every dollar is stretched thin. The walls that had held my grief would now shelter hope. 1 week later, the phone rang. It was the contractor I had contacted, his voice steadier than before. He told me the court had already frozen part of my son's assets and the first repayment had arrived in his account. It was not everything, but it was proof. The civil suit had begun, and for once, justice was moving in the right direction. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where I had once scribbled down my son's cold words. I picked up the phone and sent him a message. The house is no longer a blank check, but the door is still open for a son who knows how to apologize and who is ready to rebuild. Whether he answers or not is no longer mine to decide. As I turned out the lights, I felt the weight of 15 years shift into something lighter. Money can build a stage, yes, but only truth can light it. Family is not a birthright carved in stone. It is a title you must claim through love, through loyalty, and through honesty. And for the first time in a long time, I knew where my boundaries stood and where the future could begin.